Well, it was standing room only for the climate change sceptics in the grand ballroom of Sydney's Sheraton last night. The star attraction was Britain's Lord Christopher Monckton. Lord Monckton, good morning.
Good morning, Fran.
Is the real issue here for you political rather than environmental? Because you've been saying that the political response to climate change is a global conspiracy to create a one world government, the same sort of sentiment we heard from John.
Well, no, I didn't say it was a conspiracy to create a world government. I said there is a treaty draft in which it was very clear that a government, and the word was used in that context for the first time that I've ever seen in an international treaty, a world government was going to be created. It was going to be given overarching powers to control the economies, to tax nations that belong to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was a major grab for power by bureaucratic centralists, and they had actually put a treaty draft through which had gone through several negotiating rounds, and not one Western country had taken out the anti-democratic provisions that John Smeet has just been talking about.
This notion of world government, though,
Yes.
I mean, it's a pretty controversial term to be throwing around. Why is it any more different than the other global treaties and summits we engage in, and rules and regulations like the World Trade Organization?
Of course, the answer is because of the extraordinary powers it was going to be given. For instance, the right to set all market rules was going to be given to this new world government. There'd be no such thing as a free market anymore.
We already have market rules that the world's agreed on through the WTO.
Yes, they do, but those are agreed on as a technocratic thing. Here, they were proposing to give total control of all world markets, not just the very limited role the WTO has, to an unelected authority. Now, I think that if you need a world government, and I think that Australia is a democratic country, then it would prefer that we should, as the peoples of the world, elect that world government when it's going to be given the same powers effectively as a government here, only on a worldwide scale. No taxation without representation, that's the old principle, and democracy is a valuable thing, and I realise that the ABC is not particularly keen on that, but I am, and so are the people of Australia. Get used to it.
Well, I don't think that's true. I'm particularly very keen on democracy personally, and I work for the ABC.
So you agree with us then?
Let's leave the notion of world government aside,
Right.
and let's talk about the issue at the crux of this, which is global warming and emissions trading scheme. We better clear this up. Do you believe in global warming?
No, I believe that the world has warmed for the last 300 years, during 270 of which, on any view, we cannot have been responsible. It was a natural event, entirely within the normal fluctuations we see in the climate. In the last 30 years, we could, in theory, have had an influence. However, very careful direct measurements by a number of methods have shown that the contribution of CO2 to the warming of the last 30 years is only 1/5 at most of the warming, and that natural factors are chiefly responsible. That being the case, we can do very simple calculations to establish that CO2 is a bit part player and causes far less warming than the UN's climate panel had wished us to imagine.
It's your simple calculations, of course, are at odds with the conclusions of many others, including the National Academy of Science, the CSIRO here in this country, all the major climate centres in the country, the national science academies of most developed countries, all developed countries, I think, around the world. Why have they all got it wrong?
Who pays?
And you've got it right.
Who pays?
Who pays our scientists?
Who pays them?
Well, let me just implicit in that comment is the insinuation that scientists around the world and all these academies operate at the behest of the government that might fund them. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that
science
is what is known in economics as a monopsony. There's only one customer, and that's the state. And when you get the state worldwide all signing up to the same thing, then scientists will go along with it. They've done it time and time again before. When eugenics was fashionable in Europe and the German government adopted it, then that became the official policy, and it led to the death of millions of Jews. Same happened under Lysenko in the Soviet Union. He was a peasant who thought that if you could soak seed corn over the winter and then plant it, you'd get a better crop. That led to the starvation of millions because the state took it up, and all the national academies said, yes, yes, this is right, this is what we must follow, and they did so because the government wanted them to.
If also
that is what tends to happen. And the fact is that most of the scientists who comment on this have not necessarily addressed the central question in all this, which is how much warming will you get if you, let us say, double the CO2 in the air? The answer is you don't get very much, and there is paper after paper after paper in the scientific literature that establishes that. So the idea that just because rent-seeking scientific academies, who are these days political rather than scientific bodies, say what they say, therefore we should listen to them, when actually what you should do is get your science from the peer-reviewed scientific literature. That's how it's done.
A lot of the scientists, in fact many hundreds of the scientists, have contributed and had peer-reviewed science. There's no doubt about that. Many of the scientists contributing this
Indeed,
debate
they
are
have.
peer-reviewed.
Let me just
and
give
they
you one
point out that you're not peer-reviewed.
Let me give you one example. Well, of course, I have done one or two peer-reviewed papers, but let's just take one example, and that is the medieval warm period, when it was warmer right across the world than it is today, even though we didn't have any SUVs or power stations. How did that come about? There are 787 scientists from 462 institutions in 42 countries over the last 20 years who have contributed to papers establishing that medieval warm period was real, was global, and was warmer than the present, and yet the UN says that there wasn't a medieval warm period.
Lord Monckton, I'm at a disadvantage when we're talking about the intricacies of the science. I'm not a scientist, but I have been an observer of this political and scientific debate for a couple of years. What we all observed in Copenhagen in December is largely agreed by most to have been a failure by governments to agree.
Indeed it was.
Which would be sort of the opposite of what you were asserting there, which is this is a government, world government conspiracy.
I'm sorry, I keep saying I have not used the word conspiracy. I have said there's a coalition of very powerful financial vested interests who are wanting to help themselves to money from the taxpayer, but conspiracy is a word that I try to avoid. There is only in one narrow sense a conspiracy, and that is among the ClimateGate scientists, the leading scientists of the IPCC, emailing each other over the last 10 years, and it is very plain from those emails that these are quite nasty people who have been deliberately bending, distorting, inventing, creating, tampering with, and even destroying scientific data and not allowing other people to check their results. That's not how science is done.
You accused the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and I think others, in an open letter published earlier this year, of being responsible for the deaths of millions of people worldwide, because as the climate change debate heated up, more money was invested in biofuels that took up land, the planting of crops for biofuels that would have been used for food.
That's right.
Now, there are plenty of people who have pointed out that if we go too far along this road, that is a danger, and global poverty is an issue at the moment. But at Copenhagen, it was many of the poorer countries arguing for tougher cuts.
Yes, I know, because they too have been captured by this collective mania of the sort that we've seen so often in scientific questions before. You only have to look at the decision widely around the world to ban DDT 40 years ago. There were 50,000 deaths a year from malaria before the ban, 1 million deaths a year afterwards. People ended up dying in large numbers. It took 40 years before the World Health Organization in 2006 said politics rather than science usually prevails in this field. We will now take a stand on the science and the data, and they lifted the ban. And we do get these bad collective decisions, and what I think we should do is just be very, very careful to get the science right, because if you don't get the science right, you get the policy wrong, and if you get the policy wrong, millions die.
Lord Christopher Monckton, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast.
And thank you.
That's Lord Christopher Monckton. He's well, a leading climate change sceptic, certainly a very vociferous one, and as you've just heard, he's off to a lunchtime meeting at the Newcastle City Hall as part of his 2-week tour of Australia, which was funded in part by retired engineer John Smead.